Thank you, everyone, for joining us. Welcome to the Gold Silver Bitcoin Show, brought to you by the Gold Silver Bitcoin Store. We are more than honored to be sitting down with somebody who I've known for about a decade. His work has been heralded in the libertarian space and particularly in the freedom space. He's Marc Victor, owner of Attorneys for Freedom. You can check out his work at attorneysforfreedom.com. He's been a practicing lawyer for 27 years. He's also the founder of the global Live and Let Live movement. Thank you so much, Marc, for sitting down with us today.
Hey, thanks for having me, man. It's a pleasure to be on your show.
So I kind of want to start just real broad with, what do you think people should know about the United States legal system? What's unique about it? What's special about it?
It's certainly not perfect. There's no question about that. And there are things that I would improve in every area. But, Justin, I've traveled around the world quite frequently. And when I do go to another country, I almost always make an effort to investigate their justice system there, because it's something I'm very interested in. So I've had many conversations with with public defenders, judges, people involved in the system. I've yet to find one that I like more than the United States system. I know a lot of people say, oh, it's corrupt and this and that. A lot of libertarians take that position. I've not seen that at all. I'm not saying there's no corruption in the system. But if what you mean by corruption is things like bribes and payoffs and stuff like that, not the case. Again, I mean, I'm certain there's some isolated issues. There are corrupt people in the justice system, but that is by far the exception, not the rule. Same can be said about racism. I know people take a different position than I do on this point. I've not seen systematic racism in our justice system, and my position is shared by many people who work in the justice system as well. I've been looking to make the argument for 27 years that my client is being treated differently because of the color of their skin or where they're from or something like that. I've never once even made that argument because I've never felt that way. We have a very diverse group of people who work in the justice system, all the way up to the United States Supreme Court, and in every aspect of law enforcement, judges, prosecutors, criminal defense lawyers, probation officers. So again, not to say that there's not racist people in the system. I mean, you can never get perfection, but these aren't our problems. If you want to know what the major problems are in the United States justice system, the law is screwed up, right? No matter how good everything else is, if we still have victimless crimes in the justice system, you're always going to have a screwed up justice system, right? Even if we do a good job at figuring out who's actually guilty. If you're actually guilty of something that shouldn't be a crime, okay, there's a major problem there. And to me, this is one of the biggest outrages of our time, something we should be really, really concerned about, which is huge numbers of people rotting away in jails and in prisons right now throughout our country for victimless crimes. And again, I'm not just talking about possession of marijuana. I recognize that, yes, we're moving in the right direction here, but it's people who grow marijuana, people who sell it, people who transport it. These are all victimless crimes. And of course, the same can be said for every drug that is currently illegal, right? I've got an article out there entitled Legalize Methamphetamine. That's been out there for probably close to 20 years now. So, the fundamental issues of you own your own body. And if you're a competent adult, you get to decide what you put in your own body. These issues are the same regardless of what you're putting in your body, no matter how harmful it is.
At Bitcoin 2021, Ron Paul kicked off the event, and he spoke not about Bitcoin, but about financial freedom and freedom generally. He talked about Ron Paul type things. And one of the things he mentioned was the war on drugs. He mentioned that he believes that all drugs should be legalized, essentially. And he also expounded on that from a personal perspective, because he says a lot of people say that and they think that he's therefore pro-drug, but he says, I'm not pro-drug whatsoever. In fact, he's never even seen marijuana, he noted. So I'm curious, could you maybe elaborate on like a world in which methamphetamine was legal? Because I think a lot of people, really, especially conservatives, who are a cousin of the libertarian movement. However, there's a lot of novel differences between the two, I think, philosophies. They look at this and they imagine a bunch of kids in school taking meth. So can you expound on that a little bit more?
Yeah, this is a really excellent point, and thanks for making it, because those of us who have been around the freedom movement a long time, we skip over this because it seems so obvious, right? So let me just, in order to make this point, I'll use a slightly different subject, right? I mean, it's certainly conceivable for somebody to say, I think prostitution is a immoral thing to do and shouldn't be done, and I would try to talk everybody out of being involved in prostitution and this, that, and the next thing. However, because you're only assuming you're dealing with competent adults here, because people own themselves, I wouldn't be in favor of prostitution being illegal. So that important difference, right? The critically important difference between a moral position and a legal position is something we need to do a much better job explaining. So that I say that take, for example, methamphetamine, that I say that methamphetamine should be legal doesn't prevent me from just as loudly and just as enthusiastically saying things like, boy, you're an idiot if you decide to use methamphetamine. And I would do everything I could possibly do to talk you out of using methamphetamine and explain why this is a very bad drug and harmful for you, and all kinds of other reasons why you shouldn't take meth. But at the end of the day, if you're a competent adult and you can take meth in a way that doesn't violate the rights of another person. And what I mean by that, it doesn't violate what I now call the live and let live principle. So what is that? Well, it basically means don't be an aggressor. And so what's an aggressor? Somebody who initiates force or is involved in fraud or coercion, or does anything that creates a substantial risk of harm to another person or their property. So if you can take meth and refrain from doing one of those things, and I know a lot of people can, because I've represented a lot of them over the years who have actually been casual meth users. They take care of their kids and keep their jobs, and they smoke meth at home, and they don't go out and steal things and get into fights and things like that. They're a group of people who are in that category. In fact, I know, I'm not condoning this, but I know there are truck drivers who use methamphetamine in small amounts to stay awake over long drives. So there are ways that people can use methamphetamine that do not violate the live and let live principle. You can do anything you want as long as you don't violate the live and let live principle. That's our position in the live and let live movement. And if somebody disagrees, I'd sure love to talk to them. I mean, why would we care if somebody isn't being an aggressor and isn't doing something to create a substantial risk of harm? They might be doing something we don't agree with, right? We could say it's immoral or unhealthy or unwise or not good for them in their lives. But look, this is the nature of the fact that we're all free individuals and we're in charge of our own lives. I may value health more than you value health. You may value whatever it is, whatever benefit you get from using methamphetamine more than I care to investigate. I don't know. That's what that's the nature of freedom in a free society.
You mentioned teasing out the moral and the legal arguments. And I think this is something that we failed to do nationally when it comes to abortion, especially. I think that this discussion, pro-life, pro-choice, it is a strictly legal discussion, I suppose. It's also, I think, a kind of nonsensical dichotomy. But there is ultimately zero moral discussion taking place at the national level on the concept of abortion. It's all legal. And I think we've got two different sides that are arguing from two completely different viewpoints. We have a pro-life movement, which is largely arguing really from a moral. I would say most of their position is founded on their religious beliefs or their moral beliefs. And then on the pro-choice side of things, they're arguing from a completely legal perspective. And so I think that a lot of nonsense comes from that. Then, of course, you mentioned meth. There was in baseball, there's been speedballs that have been used historically. But one of the most absurd things is that we actually had the U.S. Congress or Senate look into steroid use in baseball, which seems to me like one of the biggest wastes of time and money that could be thought up. I'm curious, do you have any comments on the abortion from this perspective of it being both a legal and a moral argument, and how we can kind of reconcile these two things?
Yeah, well, I think you've hit on probably the most difficult issue that we have to grapple with in the freedom crowd, the question of abortion, which frankly, I load into this same question, the question of animal rights, because they're really the same question. The question is, at what point do we afford rights to either A, animals, non-human animals, or B, unborn human beings? And so on this issue, like many of these tough issues, these are sort of gray area issues, right? I think reasonable minds can disagree on these types of issues. As you know, there's a movement, Libertarians for Life, who take the position that the non-aggression principle ought to apply from the moment of conception. And the vast majority of libertarians, I believe, are pro-choice. But I just illustrate this to say reasonable minds can disagree on how the principle is applied. The same can be said about the live and let live principle, which is essentially the non-aggression principle. We call it something different. There's more to the live and let live movement than just the principle. But and so in these cases that are very hard questions, what the position that we take is local communities ought to decide for themselves what the rule is here. That the principle begins right at conception. I think that local community is entitled to make rules about that situation. On the other hand, you may be in a local community where they say, no, not until birth are rights afforded. You may have another community that says, well, viability is an important point here. And so I think it's too hard of a question to have a one size fits all approach. And I think local communities is the place to make the distinction, because as you know, the smaller the community, the easier it is, the lower transaction cost it is to move to the next community. And this also gets some market forces in on the decision, right? Because if one community comes up with a rule and everybody doesn't like it, they move to a different community. And so the pressure is on that one community to change their attitude about it. I can tell you my personal position on this, which is different than the position of the live and let live movement, which is what I've just laid out. Hard question, local communities ought to decide. Personally, I think that after viability, I think that if we don't think of an abortion like an abortion, which is the right to disconnect and kill, I don't see any right to kill under any construction of anything. So I think if you can disconnect, if the woman is able to disconnect and then we can save the baby and give it up for adoption, I don't think the woman, the mom, has any right to insist that the baby who has been disconnected has to be killed. So I think that post-viability, I think this is really a non-issue. I think it's a matter of we can simply evict, if you will, the post-viable fetus and then adopt out to parents who intend to be good parents. I think it's a win-win-win all the way around. It's a win for the mom who says, it's my body and I don't want a baby inside, no problem. It's a win for the baby who gets to live and gets adopted out, and it's a win for the adoptive parents. Pre-viability, the way I come down on this is I wrote an article several years ago entitled The Immorality of Eating Steak and Why I Acknowledge Your Right to Eat It. And so I think that there are some circumstances under which killing an animal just because you like the taste of its dead flesh, right? Assuming there's no health issues, there's no shortage of food otherwise. I think you can find this to be a moral question. And so I think that the law ought to allow people to eat animals, even though some people say that eating animals under certain circumstances is immoral. So same thing here for pre-viability fetuses. I think that like animals, I don't think we treat the bonobo monkey the same way that we treat a worm, for example. There are things that we care about in terms of how we value life, right? The ability to think and be conscious and feel pain and all these sort of sentiencies. And there are different, we can't just lump all the animals in one group, nor do I think we lump all humans in one group. I think those pre-viable humans, we afford them some rights, but not all rights. Again, hard questions. And so this is why I think the better practice here is sort of officially the live and let live movement official position is just let the local communities decide for themselves.
I want to talk about, again, kind of broadening it out about like what is a right, for instance. I think under the US Constitution and this nation's founding documents, a right is God-given, it's inalienable. Could you kind of speak to either in this system or in the view of the live and let live movement, What is a right?
Yeah, so we have a sort of an interesting position on this in the live and let live movement. We would say you have a right, if you're a competent adult, you have a right to not have the live and let live principle violated upon you, right? Nobody has a right to initiate force or engage in fraud or coerce you to do anything or to do anything that presents a substantial risk of harm to you or your property. That's your right. How you get that right, we don't touch that issue. There are many different arguments here. You allude to a natural rights type of a position, which is sort of a standard libertarian position. There are also social contract avenues that people use for rights as well. Some people base rights on things like economics or their religion or Ayn Rand's objectivism or something like that. We don't take a position here. I don't think it matters how you get to the live and let live principle, just that you get to the live and let live principles. And our movement is intended to be a practical movement, one that we can get people united. However it is, you think we get to the live and let live principle, we don't care. It's only that you get to the principle that's important. Personally, I'm very sympathetic to the natural rights argument. I think it's self-evident that I own me and you own you. And if you accept that, then you can certainly build from there a very viable and robust sort of slate of what I would call negative rights, right? The right to have people not violate the live and let live principle. Positive rights, on the other hand, I don't recognize any of those. And a positive right requires another person to actually do something. So for example, if you say I have a right to health care, well, what that means is somebody else has to pay for your health care. If you say I have a right to education, somebody else now has a burden to pay for your education. We reject all positive rights. You have a right to both define and pursue your own happiness, to do what you choose with your things that you own, which is your body, your property, your money, your time. You're the iron-fisted dictator of all of that. But beyond that, you have a right to be left alone. That's about it.
We've had a uproarious debate regarding the First Amendment lately and how it applies to private corporations such as the social media giants. And there seems to be two arguments. One is that they're private corporations, so the First Amendment doesn't apply to them. The other argument might look at certain privileges that these corporations are given or their importance as a utility to the public conversation and say that they must abide by First Amendment rights. What is your view? What do you think the law says about this?
Well, what my view is and what the law says about this are two different things necessarily. So I think that, I guess let me start with the notion that I don't think any private company should get any benefit from government in any way, shape, or form, right? That resolves the question. If we can remove the benefits that they get, what I would call crony capitalism, then of course you're dealing with a private company, and this is easy because the First Amendment is intended to restrict the government from restricting speech, not private companies. And so I think that we do a disservice to our movement when we push to have private companies considered like they're government companies or quasi-government companies. This is a very dangerous move, in my opinion, because it wouldn't just be First Amendment that would apply to them. It would also be due process and a whole host of other things. And, imagine private companies having the grief of not being able to terminate people because they haven't received a proper due process hearing and appeals and this and that. And so I don't think that that's the world that the people who desire freedom are wanting. I think it would be far better served. The same thing is true in the immigration context, right? A lot of people will say, well, because we have this huge social welfare state, we shouldn't allow people to come in and immigrate. Well, okay, we should fix both things, right? We should say, look, we should end the social welfare state and then allow people who want to come here not for benefits, because they would get none. The benefit they would get is the right to be left alone and not have the principle violated against them. But they would simply have the option to, like everybody else, define and pursue their happiness. And this always helps the economy. More people being here to buy things and start businesses and employ others always been a good thing. Immigration has historically been a good thing. So, I say the same thing in all of these areas. Instead of saying, well, because the government regulates the heck out of these companies, let's then treat them as government entities and say the First Amendment applies and they can't cancel who they want. I think it's a far better approach to say we should stop the crony capitalism that fuels the argument that these companies really aren't private companies anymore. Let's stop that, treat them as actual private companies, and let them do whatever they want to do as long as they don't violate the rules. So if the world that I would envision is Facebook would sink or swim on its own, no special privileges from government. But Facebook has every right to kick anybody off their platform they choose for any reason they want. Start a new platform if you don't like that. And I think a lot of people already have.
I think there's a big misconception that those who are skeptical or against welfare states don't want people to live well. But I think that it couldn't be further from the truth. If you look at what's happened in the poor communities of this country since 1965, since the Great Society was implemented and the modern welfare state started to be built out, we haven't seen the results that were probably promised back then. In fact, I think a lot of people would argue that we've seen the opposite. And I want to kind of go from the First Amendment to now the Second Amendment, which is obviously a hot topic. I'm sitting here in Idaho right now. The Second Amendment's a little bit more important here than, whether or not cannabis is a victimless crime or not. So I'm curious, can you kind of tell us about the state of the Second Amendment, like the importance and thinking behind the Second Amendment and kind of your work on the Second Amendment these days?
Yeah, well, a lot of people, at least in Arizona, very pro Second Amendment type of a state, look to me as I'm probably the most well-known Second Amendment attorney here in Arizona. And, there's the legal analysis of the Second Amendment, and then there's how Live and Let Live would approach the Second Amendment. I don't think they're all that different. In fact, I'm not that worried about the Second Amendment at the moment, speaking on the legal side for a moment. We just got 3 new justices on the United States Supreme Court. All 3, as I understand and expect, are very pro Second Amendment. So I think the Second Amendment is going to be very safe for quite some time. We had the Heller case in 2008. There's the case out of Hawaii, Young versus Hawaii. And this one squarely addresses the question about whether what we'll call the Heller doctrine should be extended to outside the home. I think it will be extended to outside the home. It's not just a matter of keeping arms, it's a matter of bearing arms. On the Live and Let Live side, I feel exactly the same way as I feel about everything else. Do whatever you want, don't violate the rules. So if you want to have a firearm, as long as you don't violate the rule, you should get to do whatever you want. Obviously, using a gun to commit a crime violates the rules. So all gun crimes should be illegal. But there are other things that a person could do with a firearm, even merely possessing one, that I think could violate the rule. For example, here's an area where I have a slight difference with the current state of the law. The current state of the law says if you have a felony on your record under federal law, you're prohibited possessor. I think that's too broad. I think if you have a violent felony on your record, now we have reason to believe that you're a substantial risk with a gun, right? Because you've proven to us that you are. You've used a firearm, you've committed a gun crime or something. I think that we can now conclude, based on your past history, that you having a gun is a substantial risk of harm to another person, and therefore you violate the rule by having a gun. And so I think we can tell that person, sorry, you can't have a gun. Now, in fairness, you may have rehabilitation over a period of time, enough time may have passed, and such a person might say, look, I'm no longer a substantial risk with a firearm. Okay, they should be entitled to a hearing with a judge and maybe a psychological evaluation and character witnesses and everything else we have in a hearing. And if a judge finds that, okay, you screwed up 20 years ago, but you know what? You've lived a good life over the last 20 or 10 or 5 or whatever the judge thinks is appropriate, you get your rights back. I think there's a couple other categories too. If you're mentally ill, if you're not competent, this is the same reason we say a 4-year-old can't have a firearm. They're a substantial risk with the gun. So is someone who has mental health issues. So we can tell that person, sorry, you can't have a gun because you're a substantial risk to another person. Third category, there might be some types of weapons that without the proper training, you're a substantial risk, right? Imagine, I often use a belt-fed, tripod-mounted, automatic 50 caliber machine gun. If you don't know what end the round exit the weapon from, okay, you're probably a substantial risk. You just don't know how to store this thing. You don't know how to use it. I'm not saying that these should be used as a mechanism to deprive people of guns, but there's a happy medium between, sorry, you need some training and nobody should have it, and you could just have anything you want without any training. I think a reasonable course for certain weapons, maybe even all weapons. I think that's a community decision, a reasonable course where we can now say, you know what, this person is not a substantial risk to another person with a firearm, even a dangerous one. Hey, if they're not a substantial risk, they should be left alone. So that's the way I see the Second Amendment and the right to keep and bear arms. It's not an absolute thing. It's not that anybody gets to have anything they want under any circumstances, right? I mean, to dispel that, you could think about the 4-year-old who claims the right to have a gun, a Second Amendment, or the person who's convicted of murder and sent to prison. That person might want to take their AR-15 with them. I think most reasonable people would say, look, sorry, you have forfeit that right to keep and bear arms. Well, if that's the case, this isn't an absolute type of a right. In fact, no right is absolute, right? I mean, you could be put in prison for committing a certain crime. We could take away your very freedom. So every right has its limits. You don't get to intrude on other people. And the gun analysis ought to be no different than the marijuana analysis. It's exactly the same question.
You broke up a little bit while you're talking about the legal basis of the Second Amendment, and particularly why you aren't too worried about it these days. You mentioned that there's 3 new Supreme Court justices that are Second Amendment friendly. Could you please kind of also elaborate again once more just why you're also confident that the Second Amendment is safe for now?
Well, one of the things we got under Trump, we got Gorsuch, we got Kavanaugh, and we got Barrett, all 3 of whom are conservative pro-Second Amendment types. You know, it'll be yet to be seen just how far they go with this, but we had remember the Heller decision was decided with Ginsburg, a liberal, on the court. Ginsburg is now gone, deceased, and we got Barrett now. So we got a very she's probably the most pro Second Amendment of the 3. And so this has been a major shift on the Supreme Court to a more pro Second Amendment type of a stand. So I'm not, look, the Supreme Court is the final say on what's constitutional. And I expect that we will get decisions. And this, of course, will take some time to shake out, right? Because they have to get the right case there for them to rule on. But I'm very confident that the Second Amendment will remain a robust, viable constitutional protection, at least for people who don't have violent felonies or regular felonies in their past and are competent and those kinds of things. I think you'll be able to both keep a firearm in your home, and eventually I think you'll have this will be interpreted to be able to carry or to bear arms outside your home as well.
Are there any amendments that you think are perhaps being chiseled away at a faster rate than is the Second Amendment, where your concerns perhaps lie?
It's a good question. Yeah, I think there's a lot of things. Well, first off, I like to start with the 9th Amendment. I know people think, what, 9th Amendment? What the heck's the 9th Amendment? But, you know, I cite the 9th Amendment. I try to argue it. This could have been a great amendment. This could have been, look, if you just put me in charge of the 9th Amendment and the Supreme Court will be in charge of everything else, we'd be in great shape. That was the amendment that I think the founders were trying to say, look, just because we listed these other rights in the Bill of Rights doesn't mean we've exhausted all rights. There's a whole bunch of other unenumerated rights in the 9th Amendment. Well, the courts never found any of them. So that 9th Amendment could have been a really fertile ground. For example, they could have found a right to peacefully smoke marijuana in the 9th Amendment. They didn't, but I wish they had. There could be many different rights, a right to self-determination, the right to try different drugs, right to die if you want, if you will, right to marry whoever you want to marry. They could have done a lot with the Ninth Amendment, but they didn't do anything with that. So that's unfortunate. There's not one right that's been found in the Ninth Amendment. The Fourth Amendment's been a huge casualty as a result of this horrendously a bad idea to run this drug war. And so in the name of allowing law enforcement to sort of smash front doors and enter and search and seize, Fourth Amendment has gone through a horrible storm of things for law enforcement to go seize the green leafy substance. So I think that there are some changes that could be done there. I mean, look, at the end of the day, the Fourth Amendment only protects your right to be free from unreasonable searches and seizures. It doesn't say anything about what's reasonable. That's for the court to define. And I think they've done in this area a disservice by making it too easy for law enforcement to sort of mess with the average person. A good example of this might be the Wren case, WHREN, I think is how it's spelled if people want to look this up. In that case, the Supreme Court basically allowed an officer to pull a person over for any violation whatsoever, no matter how minor, even if the officer didn't really care about that violation, just wanted to pull the person over and take a look in the car and this and that. This eviscerates really a right to be left alone, because nobody drives free of all traffic violations, right? Even weaving within a lane now is a reason to be pulled over. And who drives perfectly parallel with the lane line? So, think about your tires are bald, there's a crack on your windshield, you have a tail light out somewhere. These are all reasons to pull somebody over. It's just far too easy to pull somebody over. And then, of course, once they're over, you can get everybody out of the car. I think this is wrong too. Front seat passengers, back seat passengers, you can detain everybody. So I think the law has become a little unbalanced in the name of the drug war in favor of law enforcement. I think we need to rebalance a little bit there as well.
So you're essentially asserting that, like, for instance, getting pulled over for a cracked windshield shouldn't then be probable cause for essentially a search of everything that's going on. I mean, that's how it kind of works. I think in the police officer's mind is that a minor violation might lead to a major violation.
Well, technically, that's not the way the law is written. They get to pull you over. They don't get an automatic free search, but we still have this vehicle exception, which I think we shouldn't have. This emanates from this notion that if there's probable cause, because vehicles are movable and there's just simply not enough time to get a warrant, then the police get to search the entire vehicle. I think this is outdated. Officers can get warrants in a matter of minutes now. They have computers in their car and they can transmit data to a judicial officer who can then make a decision about whether to issue a warrant. So we should do away with the vehicle exception entirely, because this only existed in a time where we didn't have the technology to get warrants very quickly. Now we do. So the law should catch up with this.
And I would say in practice, it works out to be that, like, once you're kind of pulled over, you're sort of in this temporal space where just a whole bunch of stuff can happen. And so that's why I kind of mentioned that, like, with the minor probable cause to get pulled over, once you do get pulled over, not legally speaking, but in practice, you do enter this kind of like new space and time where it's going to be very hard to convince an officer that that smell coming from your car maybe isn't his concern, or perhaps no smell at all. Just even if they just said, hey, I want to take a look around your car, your eyes are red, for instance, et cetera. And of course,
we have some rules here in Arizona now that require the person to answer the question from law enforcement about whether they have a firearm in the car, and to allow the officer to actually seize the firearm for the duration of the stop. I'm against all of this. I don't think people should have to answer questions from police. I think they have a right to remain silent, nor do I think that officers should have a right to seize firearms from people without more facts, right? Because people get to carry guns, and just the mere presence of a gun, I understand it might be safer for law enforcement and they might feel more comfortable that they are in control of the firearm, but you don't get to take somebody's property without due process of law. And that's exactly what's happening in these cases. And so I think this should also be unconstitutional.
Also, civil asset forfeiture comes to mind as you're talking about that a little bit. Do you have any comments on civil asset forfeiture? There is a story out of Santa Monica, I believe, Los Angeles, where authorities, I believe the FBI, along with local law enforcement, were able to go into a private vault establishment. This is a place where a lot of people will store valuables like precious metals in particular, etc. And they essentially searched it under the guise that there was drug proceeds from drug dealing being held there. They were able to go into every single vault at the U.S. Private Vault, I believe was the name of the business, and basically confiscate everything. One man clawed back his $30,000, which he had apparently made from being a chef. They said that he had been making bongs on the side, and therefore they assumed that the proceeds were from the sale of drugs. This was not proven. And so this gentleman got his money back, but they're still holding on to millions of dollars. So this is an example of civil asset forfeiture, which can you kind of explain what civil asset forfeiture is, and then also explain the constitutional basis or unconstitutional basis thereof?
Yeah, I mean, I think civil asset forfeiture should be completely done away with. I think this is outrageous. The idea here is that there's an action brought against the property. Like there's this fiction here that the property did something wrong. The property is sort of guilty of doing something bad, and so they get to seize the property. I'm not necessarily against it in the case where an individual has been convicted of a crime and the property that the individual has is proceeds of the crime. But imagine we're dealing now with real crimes, right? So if you're running a fraud, you're defrauding people, and you have these assets that you bought a bunch of cars with the proceeds from the fraud. I got no problem. Once you've been convicted of the fraud, at a proper hearing with due process and all that, seizing the proceeds of that fraud and distributing that back to the victims of the fraud. I have no issue with that. But without bringing the criminal action to say, well, this property is guilty of a crime and we're going to seize the property either on criminal for asset forfeiture or civil asset forfeiture. I don't think we need this at all. I think we should completely, I mean, property can't be guilty of doing something wrong. Property is just property and it has to be owned by somebody. So I think we'd be well served to just completely abolish it. Other than the circumstances that I'm pointing out, I think we should completely abolish asset forfeiture. And as far as the constitutional basis of this, I have no idea how on earth this is constitutional. It seems completely unconstitutional to me.
It seems like there's a lot of support across the aisle for things like stamping out no-knock raids. I think if most people knew what civil asset forfeiture was, they would think it was appalling. So on one hand, I mean, I think that we have the political will. I don't know if we have the political will, but the people have the will to end no-knock raids. I think this is on both sides of the aisle. I think that there's a certain sect of the Republican Party these days, or the conservative movement, which is actually quite libertarian, essentially. And in so many ways, the Republican Party over the last 5 years has been kind of like infiltrated by libertarians. Perhaps Ron Paul was the one who kind of waved the banner. And that's one of the things that I always take a look back at when I'm looking at the two-party system, is that, you know, Ron Paul called himself a Republican, and that very well may be the only reason why any of us know who Ron Paul is. Imagine if he had just ran as a libertarian his whole career, would he have ever even been elected? So we have this Ron Paul Republican sector of the Republican Party, which I think, against no-knock raids, thinks civil asset forfeiture is absurd and could educate their conservative counterparts in the Republican Party. We already know, I think, on what's termed the left, or what is termed liberal. Maybe they're a little bit more Stalinist these days. They also obviously want to put an end to no-knock raids. And I think if they understood civil asset forfeiture, they would think it was pretty silly as well, or unconstitutional. I'm curious. I want to kind of back up a bit and talk back to gun ownership. I know this is you are one of the leading lawyers in Arizona on the Second Amendment. Could you kind of for our gun owners out there, let them know what they need to know about their rights?
I have about a 3-hour talk I do on this point. People can get it from our website if they go to attorneysforfreedom.com. There's also a pamphlet I've written called The 5 Things Every Responsible Gun Owner Ought to Know. And so there's a lot packed into there. But I just basically tell people to be very, very conservative. I think that before you pull out your firearm, I think there can be lots of things that can go wrong here. And it needs to be very, very, very serious. Like, you're going to be dead if you don't pull out your firearm, or somebody you love or really like a lot is going to be dead or seriously injured. If it's something short of that, I think you shouldn't pull out your firearm. I think you should be very, very conservative in terms of pulling out a firearm, because you're operating under certain facts. And that's always what we're arguing about in these cases, are the facts. Just because you're saying the facts are this way, there could be many other witnesses that say, no, 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 we've got completely different facts. I think it's important for people to not make a statement after a shooting. I think as much as you want to talk to the police, I think it's best to just keep your mouth shut. You can always make a statement later on to the police. I've got several examples of when we've done this and it's worked out just fine. I think you should also be aware of mandatory minimum sentencing, because this is a huge problem. I think there's not enough awareness of how bad mandatory minimum sentences are. So in the case of gun crimes, almost everywhere you commit a serious gun crime, you're looking at a mandatory prison sentence. And in a close case, you may not want to roll the dice, right? Because you're looking at an awful lot of time. And a lot of these gun cases are close cases, right? They all turn on whether what the person did was reasonable. And you don't know who's going to be on your jury. We have a lot of idiots in the community, right? People who don't like guns at all, people who don't think clearly. And you don't really have a lot of control over who's on your jury. Yes, we can pick jurors. There are peremptory strikes. We can get rid of some jurors. But at the end of the day, you really don't know that much about these people and how they think. Who wants to trust possibly decades of your life to a group of strangers you don't know anything about? So nobody wants to be in this position. And that's why so many of these cases end in a plea bargain rather than a trial. So the best advice is to completely avoid this situation and not pull out your firearm unless you are really, really certain you're looking at a very serious situation otherwise.
You mentioned the Ninth Amendment and the Fourth Amendment as having been somewhat eviscerated over time. What about the First Amendment, and not necessarily the free speech aspect of it, but I'm curious, like, what is my right to assembly? And can a government tell me that I must stay in my home and not leave?
Well, you're in an area where there's a lot of balancing of rights, right? I mean, it depends on, like so many other things, it depends on what you believe about the facts. We have a huge problem in our country right now that we don't agree on basic facts. So if you gave me the facts, if we stipulated to facts, things take like coronavirus, for example, you don't have a right to transmit a deadly virus to another person. This violates the rule. Are you doing that with corona? I don't know. Some people say you are. Some people say you aren't. It depends on what you believe about the facts. So if we take it out of corona and we just sort of think about a virus X, if virus X is really, really communicable and really, really deadly, then yeah, I think we have a right to tell you, you don't get to go out into the world and start spreading deadly viruses on other people. So there could be a circumstance under which the government or a private person has every right to say, look, you got to stay in your house, because by merely breathing, you're sending over deadly viruses to my property. If that's actually the case, then sorry, you don't get to do that. If, on the other hand, the virus that you're breathing out is really just part of the universe, like the flu or something like this, then this is sort of a different situation. A lot of people argue that, okay, corona, while it has killed a lot of people, it's 99 point something 6, I think, percent survivable. I don't know where the risk of harm is so great that we can tell people that you can't leave your house as a result of this. Again, this is a question that I think local communities need some freedom to decide, because reasonable minds can and do disagree on this point. I think what's important is to establish the common ground of how we reason through these issues. It's not a matter of me getting to say, sorry, you're sick, you got to stay in your house. It's a matter of me saying, okay, there's this principle. We call it the live and let live principle. This is the principle that we agree on. If you're violating it, we get to stop you. If you're not violating it, you should be left alone. Let's proceed from there and analyze the question, right? So on some of the easier ones, like say back to marijuana, smoking weed in your backyard and not driving, you're not violating the principle. You should be left alone. If you get out in your car and you start driving and you're driving in a way where you're creating a substantial risk to another person or their property, okay, you're violating the rule. We have every right to tell you not to do that. The same exact analysis applies to all of the issues with lockdowns and coronavirus and all these other viruses. So there's some very hard questions in there. We did a Peace Radicals episode. That's our podcast that we do called Peace Radicals. People can find it on the Live and Let Live website if they go to liveandletlive.org and they click on Peace Radicals podcast. We did a whole show on the coronavirus where we parsed out the legality of things, how the law applies to this stuff. And we talked a lot about the Jacobson case out of Massachusetts in 1905, where the Supreme Court said, okay, Massachusetts has a right to mandate a vaccine for everybody who lives there, all residents. And we also talked about a different analysis, which how does live and let live apply to these issues? So if people are interested in a more thorough discussion on that point, they should go to liveandletlive.org, check out Peace Radicals, scroll down to the episode on coronavirus and give that a listen to.
What is a peace radical? What do you mean by that?
It's a great question. I've never been super comfortable with the word radical, right? Some people say, oh, Mark, you're a radical. Okay, I don't think it's so radical to take the position that you should be in charge of you and I should be in charge of me, and that you don't get to tell me how to run my life and I don't get to tell you how to run your life. I don't see that as such a radical position. Some people do, because it leads to conclusions like, for example, that methamphetamine ought to be legalized. Now, I don't see that so radical either, right? You get to decide what to put in your body, and up to the point that you're creating a risk of harm to me, which is maybe getting in your vehicle and driving or something like that, it's not my jurisdiction. So I don't find this as so radical, but other people might. And if they find that radical, then I'll accept the word radical. And so when we say peace radicals, yeah, I guess we're somewhat radical in the sense that we really do want to achieve peace. The Live and Let Live movement isn't just a freedom movement like the libertarians. It's a peace movement, which means that it encompasses more than just the principle that we've been talking about. It encompasses what we call aspirational values, things that move into the ethics realm. We're pushing values like open-mindedness, intolerance, and civility, and building high levels of trust with other human beings, and things like pursuing the truth and facts and rational inferences. So these are things that we would not be in favor of incorporating into the law. You have every right to live closed-minded and intolerant and not kind to anybody, but we're pushing these values. We're saying, look, you should be voluntarily kind towards other people. So this is where I think a lot of libertarians have sort of missed the mark, talking to, say, for example, our liberal friends, right? We have friends on the left who say things like, look, people are born in less fortunate situations than we are, and we should help these people. Okay, we in the Live and Let Live movement entirely agree with them. Where we differ is they think these are legal issues and they want to put them into the law and require everybody to get on board. They want to import their morality into the law and then force everybody to do the right thing, if you will. We, on the other hand, say, no, these are ethics or moral questions. They stay outside the law. It's not that we don't care about helping those less fortunate. We are very much committed to that, but we recognize it not as a legal issue, but as an ethics issue. So we're still pushing these, but we don't want to violate the principle in order to get it done. We're not going to take money against your will and force you to fund things that we think are important. And the reason for this should be obvious. We don't all agree on morality. And so the only choices we've got in this space is to have an endless arm wrestle about whose morality is going to be imported into the law, or we take it all out. And we say even the morality we agree on, like helping those less fortunate than us, even that morality is outside the law. And that's what the Live and Let Live movement is about.
And I think if we were to say, okay, let's put this in the legal realm and let's discuss how we can import this morality into law and get this done, the first place we ought to look is, okay, where's all this money that we're already putting into the legal system or into government for moral purposes going? Is it going towards sending Elon Musk to the moon, or is it going for the purposes that we wanted, we were told it would go towards, as kind of this, I guess, welfare net has been built out, particularly in the US? I think we'd find a lot of it's gone towards war, for instance. Okay,
I don't care where it goes, right? Once the money is taken, I'm sure a lot of that money goes for good purposes and helps people, but it's not the right thing to do, right? But what do we say to and I'll just pick one, what do we say to the Muslim who says, I think Sharia law is a good thing to import into the law? We only have two choices here. Choice number one, sorry, our morality is better than your morality. We're going to import ours into the law, not yours. Okay, this sets up this forever, right? Or we say, look, we don't take a position about your morality. Maybe it's a good view, but all morality should be outside the law, even the morality we agree with, because you got to convince people, persuade them, if you will, on moral issues, not force them into it. So that's how we address that question. I don't reach the issue of whether the government, after they take your money without your permission, where they spend it, whether it's erroneously spent, even if it was perfectly placed, it's still not the right thing to do.
We're going to wrap up here. I'm curious first though. So precious metals, it was illegal to own gold in this country for many years. Do you see anything like this possible again?
Well, of course, nobody can predict the future. We do have a history in our country where the government has seized gold and made it illegal to own gold in any particular large amount. I don't know what's going to happen in the future. It's certainly possible that this could happen. What I do know is we're never going to achieve peace and freedom unless and until we can get enough people on board with our project. In particular, I'm speaking about the Live and Let Live project. That's why I think the main goal should be to win enough hearts and minds, right? Well, that's our stated goal in the Live and Let Live movement. Let's persuade enough people, good people of goodwill, right? Reasonable people of the world to understand the importance of having a basic principle, the Live and Let Live principle, that we calibrate the legal rules around, and then all the good morality that we want to push. And we do want to push it, right? There's a lot of good. We don't go too far into the moral world. The things that I've talked about, open-mindedness, tolerance, voluntary kindness, civility, these kinds of things aren't very controversial, but we still need to promote these things and push these things if we're ever going to get to peace. And so when we get enough people who sign on to this idea, we're going to get freedom, period. And when will we lose it? Well, when we lose enough people to maintain it. So the goal here, if you want to get real change, is to get more people in the Live and Let Live movement. So I'll use this opportunity to encourage people listening to this program right now or watching it to just go to liveandletlive.org. If you like what you see there, join the movement. We don't need a lot from you. Put your name and email in there so you can add your name to the numbers of people who are saying enough is enough. We want to be part of a global peace movement, but that, by the way, is growing dramatically, very quickly around the world. We have at least 10 different countries in Africa, many different countries in Europe, Australia. We have lots of different places where chapters are forming, and we have not yet kicked off the movement. The Live and Let Live movement kicks off in March of 2023. So we're pre-launch. People have a great opportunity right now to get involved with something really big to help change the world, and I hope they do.
We've been more than honored to sit down today with Marc Victor of Attorneys for Freedom. He's been practicing in Arizona for a long time. I believe you're also practicing in Hawaii now as well. Great.
That's true. We do take cases across the nation. There's a rule called Pro Hac Vice that allows us to represent people in any of the 50 states, but mainly we practice in Arizona and in Hawaii. We do criminal, personal injury, civil rights, and then we have a very exciting program called the Attorneys on Retainer. It's a way to get us on board for $25 a month, especially if you're a gun owner. Just go to attorneysforfreedom.com. At the top, click on the red button. It says Attorneys on Retainer, and everything you need to know is right there. So if you want to be protected and have an attorney kind of on your side for $25 a month, easiest way to make that happen.
Mark, thank you so much for coming on the Gold Silver Bitcoin show. And thank you everyone for listening.
Thanks for having me, brother.
What's up, everyone? I hope you enjoyed the show. Head on over to GoldSilverBitcoin.com for more content like this, as well as long form written articles about precious metals, Bitcoin, and other topics. Also, check out our shop where you can get precious metals, storable foods, and all sorts of other cool survival and prep gear as well.